Well, hey there, I'm Joshua Johnson. It's great to be with you on this Friday, October 14th, and tonight we're talking to one of the officers who held the line on January 6th.
I thought I had seen it all, many times over. Yet what I witnessed and experienced on January 6, 2021 was unlike anything I had ever seen.
Former D.C. police officer Michael Fanone testified about that awful day to Congress. Now he's telling his personal story in a new book. Michael Fanone joins us live. A teenager could face adult charges for that deadly shooting rampage in Raleigh, North Carolina. We'll break down what we know so far. We're watching some major midterm debates tonight in Georgia and Wisconsin. That includes the Senate debate with Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker. Also tonight, an NBC News exclusive with one of Vladimir Putin's allies. The president of Belarus shared his thoughts on the potential nuclear threat from Russia. Plus, our experts will answer your questions on the war in Ukraine. And NASA recently tried to divert an asteroid in hopes of improving Earth's defenses.
Today, in spectacular fashion, we had that success of hitting this small asteroid in space that we've never seen before. And you're right, I haven't stopped smiling. I'm probably not stopping anytime soon. We've still got work to do.
We'll ask one of that team's leaders how well that mission was accomplished. Let's begin tonight in Raleigh, North Carolina, with a community searching for answers. Last night on this program, we told you about a gunman who was terrorizing a neighborhood there. He led police on a 4-hour manhunt through city streets. The suspect in this shooting rampage is 15 years old, and our most recent info puts him in the hospital in critical condition. The local district attorney says they plan to charge him as an adult. The shootings killed at least 5 people, including an off-duty police officer, Nicole Connors, Mary Marshall, Susan Carnatz, James Roger Thompson, and Officer Gabriel Torres. The youngest victim was just 16 years old. 2 more people were injured. One of them, a police officer, was shot in his leg, and that officer is recovering. North Carolina's governor called these attacks the nightmare of every community. President Biden tweeted that he and the First Lady are grieving with the families of Raleigh, and he also renewed his call for an assault weapons ban. Let's begin tonight with NBC News law enforcement analyst Dermot Shea. He is a former commissioner of the NYPD. Commissioner Shea, good to have you with us, and I wonder what your sense is of where this investigation stands now. At least last night when we were talking about this, there was a lot of information we didn't know about who the shooter was or where they were or who else might be in danger. Now that there's a suspect in custody, where does the investigation go from here?
Well, I think, and you just put up the names of the victims, so I'll start there first, Joshua. It's just, it breaks your heart to see the devastation that's left behind by this senseless act. So certainly my heart goes out to everyone affected by this tragedy. As you hear about and see the investigation play out now, I would expect, they have a person in custody. They will have to make sure as it goes forward that that person acted alone. There's been no indication that he had any help in this case, but that is something that has to be done to rule that out. And then they will methodically, with taking assistance from the federal authorities, I'm sure, try to piece together exactly what happened here. What we know thus far is that this is becoming an all too familiar scene play out. Some commonalities that jump out at me, certainly you frequently hear of the shooter described as a loner. And I think the challenge for all of law enforcement and frankly, beyond law enforcement is how do you piece this together and identify these individuals before these tragedies happen?
The DA in Wake County, where this happened, says that the shooter could be charged as an adult. What goes into those decisions of whether or not to charge a juvenile or as an adult?
Yeah, well, that's all laid out by law. So this is not something that is, discretionary generally. It's state by state, have different laws, but it will come down to 2 factors: the age of the individual that's committing the crime, and then certain crimes delineated by law that if an individual this age commits this crime, they can be, if the district attorney goes that direction, charges an adult. Certainly in a case like this, that's warranted.
I have to admit that when we talk about situations like this, I'm not sure what there is that I can ask that's new. We've kind of gone through so many of these and had to talk about so many of these investigations. That record is long since broken. But I wonder if maybe because this happens so much, the way that law enforcement deals with active shooter situations in populated neighborhoods has evolved. I mean, do we deal with these matters from a law enforcement perspective differently now, maybe than we did 2 years ago, 5 years ago?
Well, I may say something that is not expected here, but I'm not sure that any law enforcement can truly prepare fully for the unexpected. I mean, you train over and over, Joshua. Certainly, there is training that goes on depending on the size of the department with bordering departments. How do you respond in a particular case? You know, in New York City, we went to steps such as we would close down a mall on a Sunday morning when no one was in there and work with different authorities and ambulances. And how would we handle a mass crime scene? How would we handle moving people in and out of an urban area? I mean, it's certainly something that law enforcement across the country is unfortunately becoming more and more familiar with the need to do this. But when these incidents happen, I don't want to make it seem like law enforcement ever is 100% fully prepared. There is always an element of responding quickly in a quick nature with limited information and making the best decisions that you can in the moment. And sometimes mistakes are made, and we've seen that in the past as well. And there's nothing to indicate anything like that happened here. But it is clearly a dangerous situation, not just for the community, but for law enforcement. And again, you said it is becoming all too common. And when you stop for a second and realize that we're talking about a 15-year-old here, it just leaves you obviously angry, but it leaves you shaking your head like we have a problem as a country here. And it's time that we grapple with all of us coming together. And it begins the conversation that we hear too often about access to guns. Sometimes it goes down a road of mental illness. I'm of the belief that it's not any one thing. It's probably a combination of these things. But we have to do better in identifying these people. You can see here in this particular case, when you hear how he was dressed, camouflage pants, backpack, there is a level that speaks to me to a level of preparedness. And there has to be warning signs somewhere that we can glean from and come together really as a community and try to do everything possible to make sure that this is the last one. And I think we all know, unfortunately, that that's probably not the case.
Unfortunately so, yeah. NBC News law enforcement analyst Dermot Shea, former commissioner of the NYPD. Sir, thank you very much. Appreciate it. The January 6th investigations involve a lot of agencies, including the FBI. But we're learning that the Bureau might need to look inward, too. NBC's Ken Dilanian and Ryan Riley obtained an internal FBI email released through a Freedom of Information Act request. It was sent to a top FBI official the week after the insurrection. The sender claimed to have first- and second-hand knowledge of agents who sympathized with the rioters. According to the email, that group comprised a sizable percentage of the Bureau. NBC Justice reporter Ryan Riley joins us now with more on his reporting. Ryan, how revelatory were these emails? Had there been any suspicions before these emails that there might be sympathizers within federal law enforcement or the FBI?
You know, this has been something that's really been lingering over the January 6th investigation, basically since the beginning. You know, the FBI, is like many law enforcement organizations. It leans conservative. Demographically, it's disproportionately white and male, and just on that alone gives you sort of a universe of individuals who typically lean more conservative than perhaps the rest of the country. And you have, a lot of former military members, for example, who go ultimately ultimately into the FBI. So it's been something that's been lingering over this investigation altogether. But there are a lot of reasons why the FBI investigation has been really complicated. It's the largest investigation in terms of number of defendants that the FBI has ever done since the beginning of its history. It's across the country. People came from all over across the country to storm the Capitol. So there's just a lot of leads to follow. The amount of digital evidence is really overwhelming for the FBI to handle. So there's a lot of complicating factors, but you can't take away the fact that a component of this does overlap with politics. The fact that there are people within the FBI who just frankly, because of their political beliefs, aren't too gung-ho about pursuing these January 6 cases.
How has the FBI responded to these revelations? I assume that they would take significant umbrage at the idea that any FBI agent would basically violate his oath and ignore a crime that the whole world saw live.
You know, they haven't really responded on the record. I think that what we can sort of what we've seen a lot of supporters of the FBI and the FBI Agents Association, which we quote in the story, for example, saying that most FBI agents can put aside their politics and do their job. But there just really were a lot of folks within the FBI who did compare this to, say, Black Lives Matter protests and didn't see how storming the U.S. Capitol and trying to interrupt the peaceful transfer of power is different from, say, a CVS in some city getting looted. That's, those just aren't two comparable things. One is going to impact the direction of the country altogether. That's not something that's going to happen if there's just some incident in some city. So there are just plain differences, and I think that that's what a lot of folks at the FBI have been emphasizing, and former FBI individuals have been confused why a lot of FBI agents haven't been able to make that distinction, because this was an attack on democracy, and that's why, in addition to all the reasons that jurisdictional reasons where the FBI is the only investigative agency that could investigate this sort of incident that takes place on federal property in the District of Columbia, where there's not a local prosecutor to take up cases as there would be in a lot of other cities. It's one of the many reasons why this is a really important investigation and something that they really wanted to get through to a lot of the broader FBI population.
Yeah, and D.C. is kind of unique in terms of the way that crimes are prosecuted because it's all federal. There's no state, county, local. It's a very different kind of jurisdiction just because of its nature as a federal city. So the FBI, as a federal law enforcement agency, is necessary, very central to this. What does this mean going forward? I mean, there have been hundreds of prosecutions so far. Quite a few have been quite successful. Does this mean that whatever tensions are within the FBI, maybe they're not actually affecting the work of FBI agents, or what does this mean going forward?
I wouldn't say that it has affected the investigation, frankly, based on my reporting. It's been something that's been bubbling up in a lot of these cases where, there are just leads that aren't pursued. And we have, in fact, a suspended FBI special agent who has publicly on a conservative media show said that, he basically trashed a lot of these tips that came in to the FBI, and has said that if he had the opportunity to go on one of these interviews, he would have purposefully botched the interview and not gotten the information out of the suspects or the targets that they were going after. He basically said he would have waved them off and said this is First Amendment protected activity, and essentially just gutted the case by himself. So you can't say it doesn't affect the investigation. I would say at the high levels for some of these more conspiracy charges, these very serious charges, I think those cases have moved forward, as we see with the Oath Keepers trial that has been unfolding for the past few weeks here in D.C. But for some of these more low level, I think, the more misdemeanor ones, I think there are just frankly going to be cases that would have otherwise been brought that might not get brought to fruition because of potentially a field office somewhere that just doesn't have a real interest in bringing some of this. And a component of this too isn't just purely politics. There is a component of some FBI agents would say that this isn't politics for them. They just don't see why they should be prioritizing misdemeanor cases. But a lot of these obviously aren't misdemeanor cases. A lot of these are very serious felonies. But if you're in a field office where you have a lot of felony cases stacked up on your plate and these misdemeanor arrests come in, there are folks who feel as though, why am I prioritizing this case over something more serious back here at home? Why does this have a broader impact? And I think that that, you know, what the FBI internally has to do is emphasize just the broader importance of this to the country for making sure that something like this, like January 6th, doesn't happen again.
And in our last few seconds, Ryan, just because this always comes up whenever we talk about internal emails, we acquired this through a Freedom of Information Act request, right? This isn't like we got it from some leak and a covert source. We made a request for these documents, and this was among the documents that came back, right?
That's right. I actually don't know where the original request came from, but what the FBI does is publish these online after someone puts in a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request. Right. It came about this week, and something interesting for us to pursue, for sure.
All right. Thank you, Ryan. That's NBC Justice reporter Ryan Riley with the latest on this from our Washington bureau. January 6th remains a traumatic memory for officers who fought the rioters. One former officer who helped defend the Capitol is telling his story in a new book. But who was Michael Fanone before the 6th? And who has he become since? He joins us to answer your questions next. We're glad you're with us for Now Tonight from NBC News. The January 6th committee just wrapped up its public hearings. Some of the most powerful testimony came from police officers who repelled the mob at the U.S. Capitol. In July of last year, the committee held a preliminary hearing with 4 officers. Among them was Michael Fanone, formerly of Washington, D.C.'s Metropolitan Police Department. Last June, Officer Fanone met with House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. He was part of a group calling for an independent commission to investigate the insurrection. Republicans would ultimately block that. But Fanone secretly recorded his conversation with McCarthy.
You've got a platform to call out the BS. The president's statements that day were BS. Saying, I mean, you know, you were on the phone with him. While you were on the phone with him, I was getting this kicked out of me, almost losing my life. The way that he, saying this is what happens when you steal an election. Go home, I love you. What the is that? That came from the President of the United States.
That is just one revelation from Michael Fanone's new book. The others center around things we never got to learn about him after the riots, namely, who he was before that awful day and who he has become since. The book is called Hold the Line, The Insurrection and One Cop's Battle for America's Soul, co-written with John Schiffman. Michael Fanone, welcome to the program. I'm glad you're with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
First of all, I just want to say I read the book. It is fantastic, and it talks about a lot of really hard stuff. I don't want to assume that all the traumas are dealt with, so just let me know if we're touching on something that's touchy. Like, I respect that. Just because you wrote about it doesn't mean it's easy to talk about every day. But with regard to that, how are you doing these days? Having had the process of writing the book and talking about what happened, how is life these days?
I mean, I'm getting by. I think that I have come to terms with January 6th and the role that I played on January 6th. What's been most difficult for me is processing everything that happened after that. I think it's been difficult for a lot of officers that were there that day, seeing the reality of their experience mischaracterized or out and out denied.
You talk about that with regard to the Kevin McCarthy conversations. Let me play one more piece of that in terms of what he mentioned about apparently, or as he put it, politicizing the insurrection. Listen.
If we don't handle it in a political way, I don't believe it happens. Now, we treat it like politics, then it just goes.
Kevin, I agree with you. The problem is, it is political because it happened here on Capitol Hill and it involved a political movement. It involved a group of extremist, right-wing element of our, American society, which was mobilized by politicians. And that's just a fact.
You've had to navigate a lot of politics since all of this happened, and you talk about how you cope with it a good deal in the book. But what has helped you get through it all, just dealing with the politics that sprang up after January 6th?
Well, first of all, I know that I have truth on my side, and I'm hyper-focused on my goal. And right now, my goal is twofold. It's acknowledgement for the officers that fought to defend democracy on January 6th, and it's accountability for those that were responsible, not just for the, micro activity of attacking the Capitol that day, but those that orchestrated that event and peddled the lies and manipulated those that went there.
You talk a lot in the book about being a police officer and how you kind of evolved as a police officer from this kind of like ass-kicking rookie who was kind of high on the adrenaline of the job to someone who kind of matured and found a different sort of empathy for the people that you interacted with. You write a lot about someone named Leslie, who was a black transgender sex worker in Washington, D.C., who was an informant and helped you learn a lot about the way things are on the street and really became quite a dear friend. A part of what you write in the book, on pages 57 and 58, you write, quote, "A lot of cops were repulsed by Leslie. They expressed shock that I would hug an HIV-positive transgender woman or kiss her on the cheek. They couldn't believe that I'd bring this woman home to meet my daughters. I guess they couldn't see her as I did, a human like any other, seeking only survival and love. I used to take her to meet younger officers after hours, to drink and play ping pong, to help them understand and get to know the kind of people they'd sworn to protect," unquote. Much of this book is critical about how policing is practiced today, and you do have a number of suggestions in the epilogue. What was it that opened you up to being more empathetic towards someone like Leslie? Was it just kind of happenstance as a result of needing her as an informant, or what opened that door for you?
I mean, what opened the door for me was recognizing that I had a lot more in common with the people that I was policing than were differences. I was a white kid from the suburbs. I started my education in private schools. But I also spent a lot of time working, some blue-collar jobs, and I knew what it was like to live paycheck to paycheck, and in some circumstances, even worse off than that. And so I started to empathize with people that were living at or below the poverty line, and understanding what it was like to really have to fight on a daily basis to survive. And the reason I included that aspect in the book was not to be critical of my colleagues and coworkers, but it was really, the conversation about policing and police reform is incredibly important to me. And I wanted people to understand what it was like to be a street cop for 20 years in the inner city, to see the, experiences that I had, the pitfalls that I fell into as a police officer, in hopes that, this would help engage in a more productive conversation about policing, and recognize that, officers are human beings too, as well as, the need for empathy and compassion in those that we're charged with protecting.
With regard to empathy and compassion, I don't know if I'd call it empathy, but there's certainly a measure of understanding that you bring, or perspective about the people who attacked the Capitol, including one man in particular, Daniel J. Rodriguez, who was investigated for attacking you with a stun gun. You write about the FBI interrogation of him on page 143, and you described him as a failed drug dealer so desperate for a sense of belonging that he became an easy mark for a cult. He told the FBI agents that the people that he associated with made him feel proud and important. They gave him a sense of purpose. Knowing what you know now about the people who were in that mob, what do you think about the way forward in terms of the people who've been kind of caught up in the thrall of this so-called big lie? Are they reachable, or are they kind of beyond reaching?
I mean, unfortunately, I think the people that still are diehard Trump fans, and I'm not talking about Republicans, I'm talking about Trump supporters, I do believe that they are unreachable. I think that the only way forward is accountability for people that broke the law. If there's, if you have bare criminal culpability for the actions that took place on January 6th, you need to be brought, before a jury of your peers and tried. I don't think there's as many as, we may think or is portrayed sometimes in the media. I think what's worse than the people that still hold on to this, Trumpism are the people that are indifferent. The Americans that are indifferent to what happened on January 6th, the Americans that are indifferent to the pain and suffering that Donald Trump has caused so many other American citizens. And I think it's that indifference that's most dangerous.
We heard from some viewers who absolutely loved the book, and I do want to get to one or two questions while I've got you before I have to let you go. Sherna wrote on Facebook what the main lesson is that you would like others to learn from your experience, and what advice would you give to the world about taking a stand for justice?
Well, I'll answer the latter question first. It's important. I took a stand and I continue to speak out for one reason, and that's a lesson that I learned when I was very young. I spent a lot of time out of doors, and my mentors taught me that you need to leave a place better than you found it. And so I'm speaking out because I want to leave this country better off than I found it for my children. But it's costly. I will say that. It cost me my career, and it cost me many of my friends, and unfortunately even some of my family members. The theme of the book, I think, overall, is what I was just talking about. And it's that, whether it's in policing, police reform, or really any other conversation that we're trying to have in this country, it's indifference that is going to prevent us from solving these problems going forward. I think that Americans need to wake up. I think that they need to stop taking their democracy and their vote for granted. And I think that we need to learn, once again, how to put aside our differences and engage in a conversation for the better of our country.
And very briefly, in my last few seconds, what's next for you? One of our viewers, Michelle, said she loved the book. She would read anything that you write next, but she's kind of wondering what the next thing is for you in terms of this effort to hold people accountable and work on the issues that we're facing right now. Very briefly, what's next for you?
I don't have a clue. To be completely honest with you, I don't know. I mean, I'm still focused on accountability for January 6th and making sure that the officers that fought that day that, were so inspiring to me are properly acknowledged.
I hear that. That is more than enough work to keep busy. I'm so grateful that you wrote this book. We are more than our trauma. We're more than the worst day of our lives. And I think being able to read more about your life painted that picture for me in a really vivid, powerful way that I just really could not put down. The book is called Hold the Line, The Insurrection and One Cop's Battle for America's Soul. Michael Fanone, I really appreciate you making time tonight. Thank you very much.
Likewise, thank you again for having me.
Tonight's headlines begin with the midterms and two key debates. One of them, the Senate debate in Georgia. That wrapped up just as we were coming on air tonight. Republicans are pushing hard to unseat Senator Warnock in hopes of taking control of the Senate. Meanwhile, in Wisconsin, Democratic Governor Tony Evers is debating his Republican challenger, Tim Michels. But it's the Senate debate that has people talking, and those candidates took the stage last night. Republican Senator Ron Johnson is hoping to keep his seat from Democrat Mandela Barnes. NBC's Shaquille Brewster has more on that.
here in one of the country's closest and tightest battleground states. The focus both tonight and yesterday have been on the debates, the debate for Senate and the debate for governor. Yesterday's Senate debate between Senator Ron Johnson and the challenger, Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes. And it was clear when you saw the two go back and forth, armed with their fresh one-liners and attacks against the others, that the dynamics in that race have fundamentally changed. Part of that is because of the Marquette University poll that we saw showing Senator Johnson pulling ahead in this race, completely reversing the lead that Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes had just a couple of months ago. And part of the change that we've seen here in Wisconsin are the flood of ads and attacks against the lieutenant governor, saying that he wants to defund the police, saying that he's weak on crime. We heard that same messaging coming from Republican Ron Johnson on the debate stage yesterday, and we got a hint of how Democrats are trying to push back against that. Not only did Mandela Barnes go on the offensive in that issue, talking about the January 6th insurrection and Johnson's response to it, you also heard him emphasize his economic message and emphasize the issue of abortion. Those are issues that we're also going to see on the debate stage tonight as the gubernatorial candidates face off, and that we'll likely hear all the way up until Election Day, because here in Wisconsin, every election is close, and that is definitely not the exception with both of these marquee matchups here in the state of Wisconsin. Back to you.
That was NBC's Shaquille Brewster reporting. Two rival grocery stores are planning to merge. Today, Kroger announced plans to buy Albertsons. The deal is worth nearly $25 billion. Kroger is currently America's second largest grocery chain. Albertsons is fourth behind Costco. Walmart is number one. But combining would make the new conglomerate a closer second. They employ more than 700,000 people combined across about 5,000 stores. Inflation's making this a challenging time for grocers. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, food prices have risen more than 11% from last year. This deal needs approval from regulators to move forward. Film and TV fans are saying goodbye to actor Robbie Coltrane. The Scotsman who played Rubeus Hagrid in the Harry Potter movies died today. He was also known for his role in the British crime series Cracker. That role won Mr. Coltrane the BAFTA Award for Best Actor 3 years in a row. He also played Valentin Zukovsky in the James Bond movies, as you can see. A statement from Harry Potter star Daniel Radcliffe reads in part, quote, "Robbie was one of the funniest people I've met and used to keep us laughing constantly as kids on the set. I've especially fond memories of him keeping our spirits up on Prisoner of Azkaban when we were all hiding from the torrential rain for hours in Hagrid's hut. He was an incredible actor and a lovely man," unquote. Robbie Coltrane lived to be 72. Up next, your questions on the war in Ukraine. Russia has ramped up its attacks over the past week, and Vladimir Putin has threatened nuclear retaliation. But what can we really expect? We'll ask the experts just ahead. Stay close. Russian President Vladimir Putin says his actions in Ukraine are, in his words, correct and timely. He added that his mobilization of Army reservists will be completed in 2 weeks. Putin's remarks come as intense fighting continues in Ukraine. Today, Russian forces carried out missile strikes in Kharkiv and Zaporizhia. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces are gaining ground in occupied territories. Also, the U.S. just approved another security assistance package for Ukraine. This one is worth $725 million. NBC's Cal Perry has more from Kyiv.
Heavy fighting continuing in the eastern part of the country and in the southern part of the country. This really has been a new onslaught by the Russians over the course of a week, continuing to fire rockets and send drones across the country. Now, in the eastern part of the country, in the Kharkiv region, at least 3 buildings, we understand, have been hit. Authorities saying they are residential buildings. They are working on rescuing people. An unknown number of injured and dead in that attack. In the western part of the country, strikes continue. It has been infrastructure targets that have been repeatedly hit. And in the southern part of the country, in and around Kherson, the fighting is fierce. and the Russians have announced that they will evacuate that town. Now, they call it an evacuation for humanitarian reasons. The Ukrainian government will undoubtedly call it an abduction. This has happened in the past. Russia is doing this to try to move people back into Russia. It is something that Ukraine has complained about to the international community and the United Nations. We'll see if that evacuation does indeed take place. But again, those lines continue to change as the Ukrainian army is on the move in two separate parts of the country.
That's NBC's Cal Perry reporting from Kyiv. Well, Vladimir Putin has been threatening to use nuclear weapons since this war began. Today, we heard from one of his close allies, Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus. That's the gentleman on the left. NBC senior international correspondent Keir Simmons asked President Lukashenko about Putin's threats.
Do you think President Putin would use a nuclear weapon?
If you put a person or a country into the corner, there's only one way out from there, to move forward. That's why you don't cross red lines. You cannot cross them.
President Lukashenko added that Russian leadership has never set a goal to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. So, is a nuclear escalation likely? And how would the world react to that? Joining us to answer that and more of your questions is Sharon Squassoni, a research professor at the George Washington University. In the past, she has focused on arms control and disarmament at the State Department. Professor, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Thank you.
Could we start with that vague comment from Alexander Lukashenko about putting a person in a corner and there being only one way out? What do you make of that?
So there's been a lot of what we call nuclear saber rattling, right? So far, President Putin's threats have been rather vague. He hasn't actually drawn very specific red lines. And so it's hard to know whether, he might at some point feel backed into a corner. When I look at his tactical and his strategic objectives, it seems crazy to me that nuclear weapons, whether it's a small one or a large one, would help him achieve any of those objectives. I think any use of nuclear weapons is going to provoke a very severe response.
Let me get to some of our audience's questions. First, about Russia's nuclear arsenal. Anna asked, in kindergarten, we practiced duck and cover drills. Then the nuclear weapons were large and destroyed whole cities. I'm interested in these quote unquote smaller size tactical nukes. What are their sizes and how destructive can they be? Anna, thank you for that question. Professor, tell us about the kinds of nuclear weapons that we believe Russia has. I think we have kind of an idea from what Anna's talking about from these duck and cover drills of what we saw in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Is that what we're talking about, or are we talking about something else?
Well, it's interesting, I think about the Hiroshima weapon as kind of the original tactical nuclear weapon. It was about 15 kilotons, and it was detonated in the air, which meant it had a very big explosion and it contaminated a wide area. Tactical nuclear weapons are, first of all, they're not the weapons that are on these intercontinental ballistic missiles that can, go 5,000 miles, 10,000 miles. They are, sometimes people call them battlefield nuclear weapons, but don't be mistaken, they are not small. So typically in a modern arsenal, in the US and Russian arsenals, the yields of these weapons can range from, a kiloton to 100 kilotons. And that is many, many times greater than what we saw in Hiroshima.
Laura emailed, what type of defense do we have if Putin actually uses nuclear warfare? Professor?
So this answer is going to make you uncomfortable. We don't have a lot of defenses, right? So, we have been working on theater ballistic missile defenses, and we've stationed them mostly, we've been working on them against, an Iranian or a North Korean missile salvo. But, if you have to ask yourself, if Russia used a nuclear weapon, what would be its objective and how would it what would they use? Would they use a bomb delivered from an aircraft? Would they use a missile? Bombs, we do have some kinds of air defenses. And actually right now, Europe is thinking about investing in more air and missile defenses. But, shooting down that missile is a little tough.
Can you level set for us a little bit? I got to let you go in a second, but part of me feels very journalistically convicted and nervous about discussing this at all, because I don't want to freak people out over something that may not happen or that Vladimir Putin may very well know is the dumbest thing he could possibly do. How much should we even be entertaining this thought? Just because he has nukes and says he'll use them, that doesn't mean that he will, because we kind of know how that's going to end. So how much should this even be on our minds?
I think it should be, this is a risk that has existed since the beginning of the nuclear age. And we've had, some years have been scarier than others. Right now, we have a leader of a country who is waging a very aggressive war, and he is making nuclear threats. So on the one hand, I think we have to take it seriously. On the other hand, I think we will have a good sense if he starts to move towards actually deploying nuclear weapons. We'll see those signs. Remember also, we've had, about 30 years of arms control, actually longer than that, since the 1960s. Arms control and confidence building measures with the Russians. We have a pretty good idea of, who they are and what their doctrine is. Right. And we also have channels to, both signal and talk frankly to Putin.
GW Professor Sharon Squassoni, appreciate you answering some questions for us tonight. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Here's another big threat worth talking about, an asteroid. If one was ever headed toward Earth, we may be better prepared to deflect it. A look at NASA's mission to literally save the Earth before we go. It is a first for humanity. NASA successfully changed the path of an asteroid. 2 weeks ago, the space agency used a spacecraft to hit the asteroid Dimorphos. NASA shared the news in a press conference on Tuesday.
Now, this is a watershed moment for planetary defense and a watershed moment for humanity. And this mission shows that NASA is trying to be ready for whatever the universe throws at us.
The mission was called DART, the Double Asteroid Redirection Test. Granted, this asteroid did not pose a threat to Earth. It was just a test target to see if asteroid deflection could work. But now, it's making history as the world's first planetary defense test. And it's also the first time we've intentionally changed the direction of a celestial body. Back with us now is Dr. Nancy Chabot, the DART coordination lead at the Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory. Teams there developed and led the DART mission. Dr. Chabot, welcome back. Good to see you again.
Oh, great to be back. It's been 18 days and a really eventful 18 days.
And you've been grinning ear to ear ever since. How much sleep have you gotten, really? Tell me the truth. How much sleep did y'all get after this impact happened? Because the teams that were behind this, you look like you could have danced on the ceiling all night long.
Well, some people got some sleep, but actually the telescopes got to work right afterwards. So even that evening, we were getting the first telescopic data, seeing the ejecta plumes and seeing the rock that was thrown off. And the telescopes have been working ever since, and the team's been working ever since. We have managed to sleep a little bit, but we have a really international team, so I guess we sleep in stages. Some people are working and some people are sleeping, so it feels like it's just going on constantly. But it's been a whirlwind of 18 days, and it was just so exciting earlier this week to make the big announcement that we did indeed successfully deflect this asteroid.
It's so cool. It is so very cool. And just the amount of, like, just the math alone, just the level of math that goes into figuring out how to fire something from the Earth and compensate for the atmosphere and various kinds of radiation and gravity and kind of make it hit the right way. I could pass out right now. But talk about some of the science that happened once the impact occurred to determine how successful the impact was.
Yeah, well, one of the main tasks we wanted to do after doing that amazing technology feat that you talked about of hitting this asteroid in space that we had never seen before when it was 7 million miles away at 14,000 miles per hour, then we wanted to know how much did we actually move it. And so telescopes here on the Earth got to work, and they took repeated measurements of this double asteroid system night after night. And we knew that it used to be that Dimorphos orbited the larger asteroid Didymos every 11 hours and 55 minutes. And by making these telescopic observations, both with optical telescopes and with radar telescopes independently, they gave the same answer that now this moon asteroid Dimorphos goes around every 11 hours and 23 minutes. And so this is an orbital change of 32 minutes. And it's a really spectacular and promising result for planetary defense and potentially applying this technique in the future if the need ever arose.
What about images of the impact? Have you been getting good pictures of the test? Will we be able to see what this actually looked like?
So the Italian Space Agency had a CubeSat, this little mini spacecraft about the size of a briefcase that did a close flyby after DART's impact 3 minutes later. It took just over 600 images actually and stored them on board. And they've been sending them back in the last days and weeks. And some of those actually were shared as well. So the Italian Space Agency is in this international collaboration with NASA for this planetary defense test mission. And the images from that little spacecraft have been just spectacular. They've seen these streamers of ejecta that have strung out from the surface. And they're putting together movies and piecing that together. Now, that spacecraft, that little mini LiCiACube, flew by 3 minutes later and then was long gone. But since then, the Hubble Space Telescope, the James Webb Space Telescope, and all of these telescopes on the Earth have been continuing to monitor it. And there's actually now a tail of ejected debris that's going for more than 10,000 kilometers behind it. So it's sort of looks like a comet almost when you look at it from these optical telescopes. So all of this is giving us insight into what type of material made up this asteroid, what sizes were, how this impact event actually happened. So much exciting science, really. I could go on, and the team's been so excited to delve into the models to try to understand this. So the period change of 32 minutes was a great initial result to release, and now we're looking forward to digging into the data even more to just understand not just what we did to Dimorphos, but what this means for potentially applying it in the future.
And briefly, before I have to let you go, what is the potential for having to apply this in the future? Does it seem like the Earth is going to need to defend from an asteroid or some other kind of celestial body anytime soon, before we go?
Well, asteroids have been hit. Earth has been hit by asteroids for billions of years, and this is going to continue in the future. So it's kind of a cosmic inevitability in a lot of ways. So it's great that we've taken this first step to potentially prevent this in the future if we needed to. The key is that along with having the technology, you need to know where the asteroids are, and you need to have the warning time. So along with planetary defense and this technology to doing something about it, you want to also find all these asteroids and track them and know where they are, and then we'll be in a great position.
Right. Dr. Nancy Chabot of Johns Hopkins, good to see you again. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Before we go, the headlines are not always bleak, but you might not know it from watching the news sometimes. And that is why we're testing out a new feature that we've tentatively called 60 Seconds of Joy. Don't time me, but here are a few stories you might have missed. Speaking of space science, astronauts are returning home from the International Space Station. They spent nearly 6 months aboard and they just splashed down. Their experiments included growing vegetables in space without soil. In Texas, a teenager with epilepsy just won the Miss Dallas Teen Pageant. Allison Appleby received a crown along with another crown for her service dog in training. Next up is the Miss Texas Pageant in May. The nation of Greece ran entirely on renewable energy for 5 hours last week. It used solar, wind, and hydroelectric power. Greek officials hope to run on at least 70% renewable energy by the year 2030. And finally, the rock band Queen unveiled a rediscovered song. It's called Face It Alone, and it was written 34 years ago. It features all the original band members, including Freddie Mercury. And with that, your weekend can begin. But you can always send us your thoughts on and questions on any of the topics we discussed tonight. We're at NBC Now Tonight on Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. You can always leave us a brief but brilliant voicemail, 888-575-2NBC. That's 888-575-2622. Or email us nowtonight@nbcnews.com. So until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. Thank you so much for making time for us. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you Monday. Good night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.